let us start from the big picture, okay? What is carbon credit markets for those who still don't know the ideas? I think many here don't have a clear idea about how this market is, how is it being traded, and what is it made for? Let me start with you, Mohammed.
Good morning, and thank you for having me here. I think when we talk about carbon markets in general, we talk about mechanisms for funding clean energy development or clean development in general, and how to build business case and generate revenue for these different projects. Government provided some support. There are some additional revenue that need to be generated, and that's a driver for the carbon markets. So when companies reduce carbon emissions by adopting technologies with a lower emission measures or removing that technology, deploying renewables, improving energy efficiency, they can claim that credit or the amount of reduction either in the compliance or voluntary market. Compliance is what is being managed and regulated by the government. Voluntary market is mostly linked to the private sector, and the companies will come forward. As normally I say for the common people, it's like the stock market. You buy and sell that carbon and the prices can go up and down. So the driver for that is really to find a mechanism for funding project and generate revenue by reducing these emissions from the different companies.
Awesome, thank you. And when we say about listing these carbon credits, there should be a registry, right? And this is why Verra is here for. So can you take us through the process? What happens, how these credits are being registered?
Of course. So when it comes to Verra, essentially what Verra is providing, it's a framework for the carbon credits to be created and then to be in order to be tradable on the market. Now how it works is that Verra is working primarily on the voluntary carbon market. The initiation process starts from the project developers. You have a project developer that would like to create one of the projects, whether it's afforestation or reforestation, whether it's efficient cook stoves, whether it's renewable energy. Now, the first step is to select a methodology, which is essentially a set of instructions on how to calculate your GHG emissions, how to determine the baseline and the additionality of the projects that it would have. Further on, there's a registration process. During that registration process, you work together with the carbon consultants, Verra technical teams, and external validation and verification bodies. This essentially allows you to determine whether your project will do what it intends to do, to verify the whole roadmap, and that the CO2 emissions will be actually reduced or removed, right? The next step, once all the checklist is done, the project comes to be, it comes to life, and the monitoring process starts. During that monitoring process, there's again a lot of cooperation between the technical teams, between the project developer and the external validation bodies. And the timeline differs. It could be 2 years, it could be 5 years. But essentially, once this whole loop is done, then the carbon credit is issued under the registry, and then it can be traded on the market.
Wow.
So that's a little bit the
okay, but when we say 2 to 5 years, let's see DelAgua's experience when they list their contracts. How much do you struggle to list, a new project? What do you think that needs to be done to make the process faster? Because, I mean, climate, we need to change it before it changes us.
I think that the registries have got a very hard role to play in all honesty. I think that there is increased rigor at the carbon credit process, which is much needed to drive confidence back into the space. Verra, Gold Standard, other registries are doing a lot of really good work to improve the quality of the audit work being conducted and the review process being conducted. The timelines aren't great for project developers like DelAgua and many other project developers around the world who rely upon the revenues generated from the trading of these credits. But if the delays allow for greater confidence in the market, for the new methodologies to be produced with greater comfort and rigor, to allow developers the ability to start utilizing different technologies to improve the monitoring and verification process, then I think it's, in a way, not a bad thing that Verra and Gold Standard are slower, but we'll hope to see that the registries play such an important role. They're kind of the gatekeepers of the methodologies, and we need the methodologies to stand up to public scrutiny. And I think that DelA's new methodologies coming out will all improve the sector, improve the space, and hopefully can increase the prices of credits to allow more projects to be developed in countries that historically have been devoid of lots of private sector investment, and now are seeing carbon as a brilliant way to drive private sector interest and demand. We work in countries in West Africa who have historically not received any support or financing of the green economy, and the governments there see carbon credits as a way to facilitate investment, to facilitate green growth, the generation of green jobs in the country. So as a result, everything that improves the sector, including methodologies, including improved review work by Verra, by Gold Standard, is all positive and beneficial in the space.
So when, after all of this process, they go to you at the end, they list the carbon credits with your platform, and then it is being traded in the market. Within this process, what do you think that needs to be fixed as well? I think it's on.
Yeah, well, first of all, it was a very politically correct answer. Obviously, if you think about the stock exchange that I think Mohammed alluded to, in a stock exchange, the share registry is the empirical record of the validity of the issuance of shares, the dematerialisation of the company into tradable instruments. And then the stock exchange is where those are traded. The registry records the transfer of the ownership and the original issuance. In the case of the carbon market, there's two types. The regulated carbon market, or mandatory market, as you alluded to, where the government issues permits to pollute, and those are retired based on a cap and trade solution, hopefully to drive things down everywhere but the UK, where there's no reductions. So the voluntary carbon market, the credits are issued for actions already taken. So obviously the critical part of all the time and cost that Euan referred to is really dependent then on monetising those assets, right? Now they're only dematerialising the carbon assets or the carbon credits that are proven under the methodologies from registries like Verra. Obviously the actions have already taken place, so therefore they can be sold as a cancellation or retirement against other organisations' emission footprint. So that is the critical part of the voluntary carbon market. It's not just the trading of the credits, which we do the trading of the credits, but 98% of the credits we trade on Carbon Trade Exchange are actually retired and cancelled as an offset, either directly by major corporates or by resale brokers or trading platforms, and those platforms are often, linked to us anyway, and then basically they sell them to companies in smaller quantities so they can retire them. It's not really designed as an investment vehicle for the carbon credits. Investment should be going into the projects, not to the carbon credits, because the project has multiple different revenue sources. And obviously if you take a renewable energy project, okay, Verra and Gold Standard can't do new versions of those today, new projects today. So there are other credit standards and registries like Global Carbon Registry, which we founded, that can deal with those newer renewable projects. And of course, in their case, the carbon that they didn't emit, because they're producing renewable energy, that means they get 1 carbon credit for every tonne of CO2 or equivalent gas they didn't emit. In the Middle East, there are huge opportunities, which we'll go into later, I'm sure, around oil and gas and fossil fuels extraction, deployment and use.
Well, let me stay with you for a second. So
Sure.
What we heard here in Abu Dhabi, they are regulating the voluntary credit market. And we've seen this problem in Australia. I don't know if in Singapore, correct me if I'm wrong, but very few markets on a national level, they are regulating the market. How does that help?
It doesn't. You should be regulating a market once it's mature, and particularly in case you think there's a risk for private individuals, which is why stock exchanges are regulated, and trading of those instruments is a regulated activity. In the voluntary carbon market, I mean, I'm not quite convinced there is a market in Abu Dhabi yet, so I'm not sure why they would regulate it when it doesn't exist. It might never get off the ground. Obviously, the voluntary aspect of the carbon market makes it imperfect, let's say, but the imperfections are ironed out by the registry and the credit standards anyway. And of course, you know, whilst the media might make big publicity about things like the Kariba project in Zimbabwe, there's still 5 million credits sitting in their buffer account that didn't get utilised against the underperformance that the media claimed happened. So if that's correct, then Verra's going to do the job to retire those credits and make everyone whole. And if it isn't correct, then that was just media spin. But the bottom line is that in the regulated markets and the voluntary regulated market, it's killed the market almost entirely. In Australia, it's almost dead in the water. Now they've removed forestry from their voluntary program from ACUs, which is just crazy. I mean, so, you know, instead of helping the market, government controls too early, I think it isn't really the right decision. And here in Dubai, of course, we don't have that same problem.
All right, just to add on top of that, indeed, as you said, the definition itself of the VCM is that it is a non-regulated market, and it's supposed to be it's supposed to enable the private sector to take quicker actions than the government does, right? Because of course, if you have a compliance market, it takes much more work and much more time needed in order to create it around. While waiting for that, you can already use what is available there in the VCM in order to take the action for the private sector.
I will come back to this part, especially when you're saying this market should not be regulated. But then what about maybe a greenwashing and, you know, fraudulent activities that could happen in this? I'll get back to this in a second. But let me get back to Dr. Mohammad now and ask you about the carbon capture and storage. And this is mainly what is your core business is all about. We hear a lot of good stories about it. I read like last week also a book for my son about look at Baba, this new technology, and they're putting in the educational system. But on the ground, what are we seeing now? Are you communicating with Verra, for example, to get these projects listed? Where are we?
I think for carbon capture, utilization and storage, the technology has been there for a long time. There have been multiple projects operational, for example, Slevner in Norway since 1996, and many other projects. If we look at what we track as an institute, we keep track on the commercial projects, the drivers, how things are moving globally. We have seen over the last 7 years an average annual increase of 30 to 40% of the number of announced projects. And here we talk about larger scale commercial projects from capture to transport to storage. Historically, the initial phase of projects were mostly linked to enhance or recovery. And that's why they were never linked to carbon markets, because we have the EUR element there. Now, many of the new projects, as per our record, 72% of the new announced projects in the CCS domain are targeted for geological deep saline aquifer storage, meaning that storage and the avoided carbon can be verified, can be reported and accounted, and then claimed against the carbon markets. To do so, you need a minimum level of regulations, MRV, in place. We need the methodology for CCS inclusion in the voluntary market. And this year there have been 2 methodologies published, one by Verra and another one by the Global Carbon Council in Qatar, where detailed guidelines have been put in place on how to generate the credit from a CCS project. None is still existent, so there is no CCS project claim credit yet, because most of the projects so far, again, linked to enhance or recovery or dependent on government support. But we expect with these methodologies coming online in the voluntary market, there will be more and more credits generated from the CCS project. Just a final remark, if we talk about CCS, we expect it to contribute around 15% of the global emission reduction by 2050.
15%.
15%
Wow.
according to the IEA scenarios and IPCC numbers, and that includes capture from a source and a direct air capture or BECS. 15%, if we look at the current emission, that means we need to deploy CCS to around 4 to 6 gigatons of carbon dioxide by 2050. Where do we stand now? The projects in the pipeline should inject half gigaton, 500 million tons by 2030. If we want to achieve our target by 2050, we need to double that. So we are still behind and moving slowly for our target, but the progress over the last 5 years has been excellent in comparison to the previous years in the domain.
Wow.
Can I jump in with a quick acronym
Please go.
description? MRV means monitoring, reporting and verification,
Yes.
which are 3 different processes. Obviously, if a project hasn't started, you can't monitor it. But the reporting, verification process and monitoring are all critical, and they're done by independent third parties in most of the credit standards, certainly within Verra, Gold Standard and Global Carbon Registry. So all those are done by third-party organisations.
And,
Sorry,
and-
the
and-
MRV
and this
things-
is where the question comes, Marcin. Doesn't this needs to be regulated so you can have a faster process for them?
Right. So the thing is, what those third parties they do, it's essentially the value that they bring is in order to make sure that even the market is not regulated, is that those all operations are legit. To put it simply, right? In other words, is that if, as you mentioned, the MRV process, if you have a project idea, you essentially need all the different type of stakeholders to check whether the roadmap that you choose will be the right one in order to achieve the results.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And the compliance and the regulation topic here, I think like we approach it from a little bit of a different perspective here. It's not supposed to be a regulated market. It's just supposed to be an easy access market for the companies in order to take their action, right?
Okay, and this is only one part, CCS, but we have so many other sectors, so many other industries. So do you have like a proper methodology for each different sector? How does it work?
Yes, exactly. So right now, when it comes to Verra, we have projects across 16 different sectors.
16.
Yeah, and that could be, then it further divides into project type, which determines the methodology. So you can have CCS.
There's hundreds of project types.
Right, exactly. But the main family, what I mean, it's indeed to simplify it, right? You have the
Subsectors.
CCS. You have renewable energy, you have ARR, and so on. And for each of them, you have a specific methodology, which again is the GHG calculating method, which provides the instruction. And thanks to these methodologies and those external validation third-party bodies, we ensure that the process is transparent and that it has actual integrity and brings additionality and value to the project itself.
And the action's already been taken, so the cook stoves you would provide have already been deployed.
Yeah,
Tell us about these cook stoves.
So I think just going back to the MRV process, that
Sure.
is always improving. It's a new market, everything is beginning to change. What I think needs to happen now at the policy level, rather than regulating the process of generation, is actually incentivizing use of credits. We have a lot of companies with big claims, big targets. There is no policing, there's no penalty, fine for most countries if you don't necessarily hit those particular targets. So taking the example of Singapore, which is really forward-thinking in the carbon credit space, every single company that emits CO2 in Singapore is required to pay a tax, 25 Singaporean dollars this year and next year, for every single CO2 emission they release. This massively incentivizes both insetting, so to reduce their tax burden, they need to do their own work to reduce the amount of CO2 that particular company is emitting, but they also facilitate and allow for the purchase of 5% of their emissions for carbon credits. This is one of the key ways to drive a a well-formed, well-working carbon credit market. We need to start making decarbonisation pay. We need to make the companies that are actually decarbonising, are actually insetting, they need to be supported in that journey. And one of the best ways of doing that is penalising and providing penalties to those that are not insetting in the same way. And offsetting is something that can be done when companies are unable to inset any further. There are so many companies in hard-to-abate sectors, such as kind of the airline sector, the shipping sector. They will never be able to hit net zero, realistically. And as a result, that's where the offsets are needed. And we have Corsia, which is very slow to operate, Article 6.4. What I would like to say today, which is like incredibly important to generating a carbon credit market, is that this is happening now. We can't have ICAO set every 6 months to make a decision. We can't have Article 6.4 discussions happening every 12 months. Things are happening on the ground in Africa, in Asia, in South America, high quality projects with the ability, which are bankable, that are generating credits that can and should be used to offset hard to abate sectors. But unfortunately, the market is often hamstrung by some delays outside of Verra and gold standard with kind of decisions at a policy international framework level. Once those are agreed, understood, kind of carried out, that will allow the market to thrive once again and to projects to get funded in countries where they're going to be most affected by climate change. And projects can be produced and developed that generate high quality credits to offset for companies that are unable to do enough insetting to hit our targets, to hit our 2050 ambitions.
Wait, just a second before you comment. So when we impose taxes on companies that are for the aim of decarbonization, doesn't it impact indirectly the private market or the carbon credit market?
The offsets are able to be offset against the tax, which is what they did in South Africa, right? So if you do an offset, you can claim that against the tax. That's the whole idea, is to drive investment into the offset market and the projects that are solving the problem in some other part of the world where they can't.
Okay.
And unfortunately, something like Corsia, to me, is the biggest greenwash scheme on the planet, frankly, because there's no real action at all. Setting targets for 2050 is ridiculous. Everyone setting those targets, is, if they're even half my age, are probably going to be retired or dead. So there's no outcome from that. If they're going to be, the greenwashing thing you referred to before, yes, that's where the regulation is more applicable in my view, not on the origination of the carbon credit or even trading voluntary carbon credits, but on companies saying they're going to be on a path to net zero and they haven't even stepped out their front door and bought offsets to prove that they are on that path. That would be a far more effective method to stimulate action. And there is lots of action that can happen in the Middle East. There are loads of project types in Verra and other registries that are applicable to the oil, gas sectors and to water regeneration, water purification, etc., that are applicable right across the Middle East, where they can produce carbon credits for positive action already taken. So they get a double benefit. They reduce their emission footprint, produce carbon credits, then you've got a market.
Mohammed, where are we on the map when it comes to the Middle East?
For CCS?
Yeah, for the carbon markets in general.
Yeah, I think let me talk about CCS and the carbon market in the Middle East. So the Middle East and Africa has started working on CCS and the idea of carbon capture sequestration. Roughly the whole pilots and things started in 2006, 2007. There are currently 3 commercial projects operational, one in Abu Dhabi, integrated with Emirates Steel, another one in Saudi Arabia, and one in Qatar. In the pipeline, there are large projects coming up, also in Saudi, UAE, Qatar, Oman. There are some offset projects from direct air capture in Kenya, which mainly targeted for the carbon market. And the offset, there's some dialogue in Morocco and Algeria and Egypt for the production of low carbon hydrogen and ammonia with the integration of CCS. So the region is progressing. The expectation based on the commitment from the national oil companies and the different governments that we will reach a capacity of 60+ million tons of carbon being captured and stored in the Middle East by 2035. So that's based on the announced commitment and sustainability reports. Now, there have been multiple initiatives for carbon markets. We heard about the carbon market in Abu Dhabi, in Saudi Arabia, in Egypt, in Africa. There have been some progress made, but in my view, it is slow and a bit lack the base and the scale to push it forward. There is a need for a better dialogue in the region on how to harmonize these markets, because we don't want to generate smaller local markets with competitions, and there will be limits on the credit generated and the type of projects and additionality in the region. So there is a need for a common guideline in the region on how to conduct and how to operate these markets. We have been talking about regulations. We need a minimum regulation maybe to start with, or what we like to call at the Institute regulatory framework guidelines, more than a strict detailed regulations at the start to push these markets forward. Let people talk to each other, generate and learn from the lesson done in different regions. Like compliance or voluntary market, they are well known and applied in multiple parts of the world. Let's bring these knowledge and lesson learned and deploy them, and learn from the challenges and the mistakes in deploying these markets and move forward in the region. Dialogue is important, and coordination guidelines are essential, I think, in the Middle East and Africa.
That's awesome. Marcin, let's go back to the greenwashing question. I mean, it's a relatively new market. If it's 50 years, but probably it's becoming more active in the last decade or so. So any new market can be exploited to greenwashing. How do you? Is it the registry part that is most responsible? Is it the third parties? How do you see it?
So indeed, when the first process of verifying the legitimacy and the accuracy of all the projects, indeed that's what I mentioned earlier. So there's VVBs working around, there's technical teams and third parties. That's the main responsibility, and that's usually why it takes time to develop a project. And sometimes it's not fully up to Verra to manage the whole time, but also we wait on the appropriate information coming from the project developers and from the VVBs themselves. Now, when it comes to the registry itself, the credit, the VCU, so Verified Carbon Unit, which is the name for the carbon credit that is under the Verra registry, never leaves the registry, right? And each of them has a unique identifier. So if there is a company that would like to either set up a project and produce the carbon credits, so to say, or a company that would like to purchase them, they need to be both registered on our registry and have an account.
But in the registry, you're doing the retirements as well.
Exactly.
That's the critical part to avoid greenwashing.
Precisely. So the retirement is essentially happens when the credit is taken out of the circulation, and the company can claim the offsets on that credits. And then the retirement means that the credit has been already used to claim the offsets, and it's end of life period.
So it can't be reused or resold.
Yeah.
And that offset certificate or retirement certificate, which we do many daily, is the verification for a company that it has taken the action it claimed. So there's no real excuse for them not to have done something towards this so-called target of net zero, because at least we know no company realistically probably can achieve net zero internally in its own right. It's going to have to use offsets. If they do it early enough and start doing it regularly, they're pricing carbon in their business and start to get on a genuine path to net zero rather than the hypothetical one, which is what greenwashing really is all about.
Precisely, yeah. And then I kind of want to add that on top of that, the greenwashing also comes with the quality of the credits, right? Whether it's actually verifiable when the project took place and whether the methodology is working as it's supposed to be. And in this case, we could give an example of, for instance, ICVCM, which is one of the key organizations in the market as well, and their CCP labels, so core carbon principles, which kind of impose the quality of a credit. And right now, for instance, we have some projects and methodologies that have this label on top of that, right? And that adds extra quality and transparency of what's going on behind the closed doors.
All right, awesome.
But I don't think you should imply that project credits that don't have that certification from ICVCM are suddenly not as good a quality, in my opinion.
Not at all. Yeah,
I don't agree with their
Indeed.
processes
Yeah,
at all. 3 years to approve 2 different project types. I mean, it's ridiculous.
Correct. It takes time.
Euan, carbon finance has supported significant projects, especially ones you're working on, like cooking solutions. So how do you see that the carbon credits continue to drive social and economic benefits, particularly in the health, education of the underdeveloped economies?
So there's many different project types, as Marcin was saying, but virtually every single project type, particularly if they're deployed in Africa, has a massive social benefit to the communities. And Verra and Gold Standard have a process of validating not just the emission reductions, but also the social benefit that is provided to the communities in which ourselves and other project developers aim to serve. Fundamentally, DelAgua, we work in the clean cooking space. We've deployed 1.6 million fuel-efficient cook stoves across Rwanda, Sierra Leone, and Gambia, and we have letters of authorization allowing us to access the Article 6 market in these countries. As a result of all the work that we've done, we have the fortunate position of being able to talk to the governments about carbon and carbon credits and the carbon markets very regularly. And the main message I hear from ministries of environment across the global south is, we know we have this problem, we've requested funding in our NDCs, unconditional targets in our NDCs, but fundamentally that capital has not flowed from the countries who are due to support those NDC commitments. And they are looking to turn towards carbon finance, private sector, to actually facilitate them to hit their obligations and actually to start to drive financing into sectors which fundamentally have, and I think will always, if it's purely non-carbon related, always be underdeveloped. People across rural Africa are cooking on wood, burning 3-stone fires, which is incredibly poor for health, incredibly poor for the environment. By providing a better solution, you have an almost instantaneous improvement in often women and girls' lives. NGOs have tried to kind of fix the crisis of dirty cooking for decades, and fundamentally they failed in that process. Whereas we've now seen with DelAgua, with other project developers operating in Africa, the deployment of millions of improved cook stoves that are improving lives every single day. And that's one of the amazing things that carbon credits are able to facilitate, is companies, organizations, governments from the global north financing projects in the global south that not only have a massive improvement on the environment, but can also massively impact positively women and children's lives in sub-Saharan Africa, in Southeast Asia, and in South America. And I think all of these things are what need to be considered when we talk about creating carbon markets. We need to be thinking about the environmental benefit, but also thinking about the people, the underlying communities that are benefiting from those projects that have been successful, are able to generate verified, high-quality emission reductions for the end user. And we've got to incentivize those end users to actually start paying and offsetting today, rather than, as Wayne says, waiting to hit their 2050 targets when fundamentally most of us will not be around at that time to see whether that has happened.
And this is where we focus exclusively on covering, trading all sorts of carbon offsets, regardless of the project type. All of our projects, which is dozens of different project types, hundreds in fact, from multiple registries. We've got over 12 registries we're connected to, including Verra VCS. Obviously, they're doing the verification work to ensure that the credits are validly issued. So there's a self-regulatory structure in place already. You know, it doesn't require additional regulation, in my view, at that level, and it hasn't added any value to it, really. For projects like yours, I mean, where they're trading maybe somewhere between $5 and $10 a credit, these are credits that could be purchased by companies as an offset. British Airways just announced recently that they were buying some new methodologies in biochar credits, and they were paying over £300 per credit. I mean, the 33,000 tonnes that they purchased, assuming they retire them, for £9 million, basically that going to offset maybe their route from Dubai to London only, whereas they could have bought 4 million, or including your projects, probably 2.5, 3 million, because they're more valuable. They could have bought and financed projects all over the world, dozens of projects. So the point is
how is the price being determined? How is the price being determined? Is it like supply demand? Is it fixed price?
Well, our system is a bottom-up solution. So the project owner or the project developer owns the credits. They're listed in the registry like Verra.
Yes.
They list them with us, put them into escrow, and they decide the price they want to sell them at. Then the buyer determines if they are happy with that price. When they aggress on the price, 95% of the proceeds go to the project.
Mm-hmm.
So that's it.
That's it, and then a little bit of to add on top of that, it indeed depends at times on the market supply and demand, but also depends on the technology and methodology that the projects use, right? How expensive is it to actually deploy and implement the project in a specific region? Like for instance, CCUS, it takes plenty of
big capital
workforce
expenditure,
and to make that happen. And also on top of that, whether the CO2 is permanently removed, so to say 100 plus years for a long period of time, or whether it's reduced or like avoided, right? So there's multiple factors that kind of influence.
Yeah, price is determined largely how much human activity is involved or capital intensive it is. So forestry projects, a lot of human activity and protection requirements there versus renewable energy where it's an infrastructure build or carbon capture and storage. In the case of cook stoves, it's a complicated labour-intensive process to deploy all those cook stoves into the villages across an African nation.
I mean, the reason I'm asking is, you know, I'm a CNBC anchor, so I'm always covering the markets, equities, fixed income. It's everything tradable by even speculators. So this is market so far, it's not for the public.
It's too young.
It's too young yet. Can it be in the future a public market? I mean, like anybody can access it.
Only if they want to offset their own personal emission footprint, and that's done through apps or resale platforms that target the individual consumers. But it's not a trading thing for trading for profit. And there was a lot of fraud back in the early 2000s that revolved around that exact issue, where people were buying carbon credits as investment and they lost all their money.
Wow, okay.
I think
So
as the market does mature to be kind of pseudo-compliance with kind of Corsia, with Article 6.4, Singapore carbon tax in South Africa, you do get to see traded commodities. So we have futures contracts for delivery of certain eligibility criteria by certain timeframes. So there's December 2025 kind of Corsia futures. In Singapore, we're seeing more and more kind of future contract guaranteeing delivery of an eligible credit at this price. But fundamentally, that's the difference between kind of pseudo-compliance and voluntary. In a voluntary space, you're doing it entirely voluntarily. And as a result, having a fixed price, having a traded commodity becomes a lot harder because people are purchasing for different reasons. Sometimes they're doing it purely for philanthropic purposes. Other people are doing it because they've had a sustainability report where they've committed to certain targets. So I think that in the voluntary space, we're going to not see kind of commoditization in the same way that in the compliance space, we're going to see it become a traded commodity because there are obligations on certain sectors like the airline industry with Corsia to utilize credits that are Corsia eligible now and in the future.
Okay. We still have a few minutes remaining, so I'm going to leave you all with your final thoughts. And if we were to meet again on the 3rd of October 2025, what would you like to see have changed in this year? Let me start with you, Dr. Mohammad.
Okay, thank you. I think for me, when we look at the markets, it's sorry. So it's a tool to push the reduction of emissions. If it's compliance pushed by regulations or voluntary company moving forward. What we want to see is to see carbon dioxide or emissions as a valuable commodity in the future, where people don't look at it as a waste and the companies don't treat it as a waste, but treat it with a value. So we can sell that carbon, we can buy it, even for the domain of CCS. Now there is a business model of importing carbon dioxide, store it underground, and charge the companies a poor rental for that storage. So having carbon as a value is very important, and that mentality will push the markets, will push the deployment of multiple carbon reduction projects, because we see the added value for that. The other important element is we talked about targets by 2050. We want to see the governments and the corporate translating that into a financial plan. I want to achieve net zero target by 2050. What is the investment plan from now till 2050 with a clear roadmap? So we avoid greenwashing, we avoid not achieving targets, we avoid not waking up on 2045 and like, oh, we didn't achieve our net zero target, let's push it to 2010 or something, 2100. So linking that to a financial plan, an investment plan from now till 2040, 50 is important to achieve these targets.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank
Mohammad.
you.
So we did speak that it's relatively a nascent market and a lot of things has to be done still. But if, for instance, as mentioned earlier, we would be focusing on Middle East and particularly in the UAE, this year there is already quite some actions that came from the government. We have the UAE Cabinet Resolution number 67 and we have the Federal Decree 11, which both of them include how carbon offsets are supposed to be dealt with. It's for now, I believe, a set of guidelines. But already the decision makers are aware of how the MRV is important, for instance, in this whole process, and how the future cooperation between the UAE and other countries internationally under the Paris Agreement and Article 6 trades, potential trades, is impactful. So essentially why I'm present in the region here, based in Dubai, is to connect both with the private sector and the public sector to help them to understand a little bit of the roadmap on how to get there and how Verra can support them with this. What I would like to see next year is essentially right now there's 5 projects in the UAE registered under Verra standard. I would try to, of course, make sure that there's more projects, maybe doubled for that. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, Marcin.
Next year, I'd love to see Verra in speeding up their work, get some of our projects registered,
all on Verra
credits. But I think, kind of more importantly, I would hope that this time next year there were talk of additional carbon taxes across the Middle East, across the world, kind of more globally. And I would hope that kind of the Corsia airline system, as well as Article 6.4, has some greater understanding, more projects that are eligible to provide offsets into those particular markets. So I'd say those are the 2 key things: improved numbers of carbon taxes, as well as a higher speed of process with people at ICAO and under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement.
Well, by this time next year, I'd like to see an unregulated carbon market here in Dubai, as distinct from the Abu Dhabi regulated one. I'm not a big fan of what happened with Corsia. This is another example of where an international global regulator has over-regulated a market that was supposed to be voluntary in the first place. Okay. Now they keep moving the goalposts and suddenly there's no product available for them to buy, even if they were willing to do so or had to do so. ICE had a futures contract for Corsia for 2024 and they closed it because they had no bids and no offers. And that was in October. So this is a December 24 contract for futures market. If you don't have the product, you can't trade it. We do spot trading for that exact reason. So it goes from an original project owner through a verified registry to someone who wants to buy it to offset their emission footprint. So I think the angle of regulatory oversight should be more at greenwashing for companies. And obviously, everyone says, well, look, we don't want to do too much because we don't admit that we're part of the problem if we're oil and gas nation. But realistically, there are huge opportunities. Nigeria alone could meet its NDC just by capturing fugitive methane emissions alone from the National Nigerian Petroleum Corporation. So there are massive opportunities across the oil and gas sector and nations that are being missed because they're trying to avoid that they're part of the problem instead of seeing it as a solution.
So, I mean, what I've learned in this panel, I mean, the question is no longer whether the carbon credit markets will play a role in the net zero, but it is how and how fast. As we've been seeing now through this panel discussion, that building probably a robust carbon credit market is a complex task, but it has lots of potential. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Appreciate it. Thank you.